We have managed to spend quite a bit of time on the theropoda, so now we should start looking at the other dinosaur suborders. We'll start with the other Saurischian dinosaurs, the Sauropodomorpha. It is within this group that the largest terrestrial animals that ever lived evolved. Like all dinosaur suborders, though, the Sauropodomorpha started small. Unlike the others, perhaps, they got very large very fast, evolutionarily speaking. Early, primitive sauropodomorphs are collectively referred to as prosauropods. By the end of the Triassic, and before dinosaurs really began to dominate the landscape, prosauropods like Plateosaurus had already evolved to be among the largest terrestrial animals. Admittedly, the non-dinosaurian competition was not all that large. Rapid growth seems to have been a feature that evolved early in sauropodomorphs, as we can see in the huge difference in size between the unhatched and adult-sized Mosasaurus and Massospondylus. Their arms, however, did not seem to grow as quickly as their legs, giving them short front limbs that were probably not used regularly in locomotion. These dinosaurs were probably obligate bipeds in their earliest forms and progressively worked their way to becoming facultative quadrupeds. The point at which we would consider them obligate quadrupeds, meaning walking bipedally was not an option, is essentially the point we stop referring to sauropodomorphs as prosauropods and start calling them sauropods. Other trends that seem to progress through the evolution of prosauropods and into sauropods include lengthening the neck, shrinking the skull, and lengthening the front limbs. Lengthening the neck made shrinking the skull a necessity for reasons having to do with leverage. You may recall from physics that the length of a lever is a factor in its mechanical advantage. In this case, gravity acting on the mass of the skull and neck provide an increasingly massive force on the neck, which is the lever in our example. The force on the neck increases proportionally with the distance from the fulcrum, which would be the base of the neck, or the transition between cervical and dorsal vertebrae. The formula is torque equals force times length, or T equals F times L. So a skull that weighs the same will require twice as much force to lift with each doubling of the neck's length. And that is not even accounting for the mass of the added neck length. Mitigating this resistance made lightening the skull and neck a requirement for lengthening it. This is the source of the selective forces, leading sauropod skulls to progressively get smaller in proportion to the rest of their bodies. It is also why the air sacs, called pleurocoels, that invaded the neck and back vertebrae, progressively invaginated further in and grew more complex, replacing bone mass with air. As you might imagine, there was a lot of torque on a sauropod's neck when it was held horizontally, which is presumed to roughly be the neutral posture for most sauropods. To avoid burning calories through muscle action to resist this force, passive tension was applied with huge ligaments spanning the distance between each neural spine, called nuchal ligaments. Large, rugose patches and knobs on these neural spines show where these nuchal ligaments attached anteriorly and posteriorly. As I mentioned, lengthening the front limbs was also a trend in sauropod evolution. Walking quadrupedally is much easier when each limb is closer to the same length, so that strides match up. Otherwise, shorter limbs have to take more steps to keep up with the longer ones. To achieve this evening of lengths between the legs and arms, sauropods walked on their fingers. Their feet remained flat or plantigrade like ours, with the metatarsals roughly parallel to the ground. Their hands, though, were digitigrade, so their digits were part of the front limb that touched the ground with the metacarpals held roughly vertical. Lengthening the arms placed the base of the neck higher, and lengthening the neck gave greater range to where the skull could be positioned. The obvious advantage that comes with this sort of arrangement is being able to reach higher, perhaps into the tops of trees. It is clear that sauropods were herbivorous, so this would grant them access to a food source not accessible by other large animals. Such an advantage might make it worth all the biophysical challenges that come with achieving such large size and such a long neck, like dealing with swallowing through such a long esophagus, or the extreme blood pressure differences between the brain and feet with the head elevated. Being as large an animal as many adult sauropods grew to be required a lot of calories for daily sustenance. They scarcely had time or even the ability to chew their food. Plant tissues are tough and difficult to extract nutrition from. Macronarian sauropods like Kyllosoria and Brachiosaurus had relatively short jaws and somewhat spoon-shaped, spatulate teeth. This means they could have done some chewing to help speed up the digestive process. Diplodocid sauropods had much daintier, pencil-shaped teeth that do not appear to have been effective for much beyond nipping off vegetation and swallowing it with hardly any mechanical processing in the mouth. Sauropods required another digestive strategy that did not require chewing. The most popular hypothesis for how they did that is that sauropods just retain their food for a long time in huge guts, letting it ferment. Fermentation would extract more calories from digesting plant material than would regular intestinal digestion alone. Sauropods had the size to support food capacities by the ton, so it seems feasible. This strategy was facilitated by yeasts and other microbes living in the stomach and using their own unique blends of enzymes to break down otherwise undigestible plant matter. Interestingly, this may have given sauropodomorphs a certain perpetual level of blood alcohol content, since ethanol is a byproduct of fermentation. That is, after all, how we make all the alcohol in all the world's varieties of adult beverages. Raging flatulence would also likely have been a byproduct of fermentation, since these yeasts also outgas carbon dioxide as part of their respiration. Methane also would be released from the decaying plant material. It is possible that all of this fermenting digestion contributed to keeping the late Jurassic one of the warmest and most photosynthetically productive times in the history of life on Earth. Having to do all this eating and moving to another place to eat left little time for much else in the daily life of a sauropod. This includes caring for young. It would probably be somewhat dangerous for mother sauropods to dote over their eggs and hatchlings anyway, as they'd be likely to accidentally step on a neighboring nest, or even their own. It seems the sauropod reproductive strategy involved laying lots of eggs and then leaving them alone to develop and hatch. This strategy, where little parental investment is made after the nest has been made and filled with fertilized eggs, is called the R strategy. The opposite of the R strategy, where lots of parental investment is made caring for young as soon as they hatch, is called the K strategy. K and R are factors in a formula designed to calculate the selective pressures involved with parental care in a species. K refers to the carrying capacity of an environment, and R refers to reproduction. K-selected species invest heavily in altricial offspring that tend to need a lot of investment and would otherwise not survive on their own until reaching an advanced level of maturity. Humans are probably the epitome of K-selection. R-selected species are precocial, born ready to take care of themselves, and usually born with lots of siblings that will likely die on their way to adulthood. Imagine hatching sea turtles wriggling their way across a beach, getting picked off by flocks of seagulls before they make it to the water. Life is cheap under the R-selection model. Through the Jurassic, sauropods diversified into groups that seemed adapted to feeding at different levels, ground level, above ground level, and way above ground level. The diplodocid sauropods, like Diplodocus and Brontosaurus, held their necks low, probably feeding on aquatic plants and algae, ferns, and short shrubs. The Kyllosaurs were the generalist sauropods, with relatively small, not quite reaching 18 meters or 60 feet in length, and with short necks. They specialized on low to medium height browsing. The Brachiosaurs were adapted to high browsing, with their extraordinarily long necks, and with arms longer than their legs, positioning the base of the neck higher as well. The end of the Jurassic saw the demise of most sauropod clades. Only the Brachiosaurs seem to have made it through. From the Brachiosaurs, the Titanosaurs evolved, and they replaced the Brachiosaurs, and remain the only group of sauropods to make it through to the end of the Cretaceous. The largest titanosaurs, like Argentinosaurus, grew to lengths perhaps greater than 35 meters or 115 feet. These animals were the largest and most massive animals ever to walk the earth. No sauropods ever really developed an efficient means of chewing their food, though. To find dinosaurs that did that, we have to look to another order of dinosaurs, the Ornithischia. The three major clades of Ornithischian dinosaurs are the Thyreophora, which we will discuss this week, the Ornithopoda, and the Marginocephalia. In addition to the Ornithischian hip structure partially composed of boomerang-shaped pubes, with one wing running parallel to the ischia, Ornithischian dinosaurs have an extra bone in their skulls at the front of their lower jaws called a predennary. Predennary bones would have been covered in a keratinous, horny, beak-like structure called a rhampotheca. Something else unique to Ornithischians is inset teeth in the cheek region. Their tooth rows toward the back of their jaws, closer to the center of their skulls than the outside, suggests that Ornithischian dinosaurs had fleshy cheeks. Cheeks are important for holding food in the mouth while it is being chewed. With the exception of the small beak at the front of the jaws, this would have made the faces of Ornithischian dinosaurs look more mammal-like, in a way, and less like any other reptiles or birds we are familiar with. Additionally, the presence of edentulous or toothless regions in the jaws is a mammal-like feature that appears early in Ornithischian dinosaurs and only later starts to appear in herbivorous theropods to some extent. These toothless gaps between biting or chewing surfaces are called diastema. The clade of Ornithischians we will cover this week were probably not the most apt chewers, despite having cheeks and jaws better adapted to chewing than other dinosaurs. The armored dinosaurs, or Thyreophorans, all tend to have tiny teeth. The uniting and name-inspiring feature of these dinosaurs are the large bones that were not part of the mesodermal skeleton, but instead grew from the skin and protruded from the epidermis. In primitive Thyreophorans like Scutellosaurus and Scelidosaurus, this dermal armor was composed of a scattering of relatively small ossicles along the top and sides of the neck and back. This generalized armor seems to become more specialized and heavier through the evolution of the armored dinosaurs. The Thyreophora fit into two suborders, the Stegosauria and Kyllosoria. Stegosaurs are most recognizable by the two rows of plates that ran along either side of the dorsal midline. They also tended to have large spikes on their tails, probably used for defense. These unique tail spikes are technically called thagomizers, though the technical name was inspired by a Gary Larson comic. The root word, thag, refers to a fictitious caveman named Thag who apparently met his doom at the end of a stegosaur tale. Stegosaurs may have been the butt of more dinosaur jokes than any other group of dinosaurs. A lot of this tomfoolery comes from the notion proposed more than a century ago, suggesting that some dinosaurs may have had a sort of second brain in the form of an enlargement of the neural ganglion in the hip region. This idea was originally suggested for sauropods like Camarasaurus by O.C. Marsh, a historically significant paleontologist we will discuss closer to the end of the course. Marsh thought the broad neural canal in the sacral vertebrae may have been occupied by motor function controlling neurons, as he thought the tiny brain in the distantly located skull would possibly be insufficient to serve as the complete neural processing center for the whole dinosaur. Later, when Marsh was describing one of the numerous Stegosaurus species he named, he proposed a similar butt-brain arrangement for Stegosaurid dinosaurs. Now we know that some birds have similarly enlarged neural canals in their anterior sacral vertebrae, and that they house an organ called a glycogen body here. This organ serves to store chemical energy in the form of complex sugar called glycogen that can be accessed rapidly to supply caloric energy to the central nervous system on demand. Glycogen bodies housed at the base of the dorsal spine may be an organ all dinosaurs had. The other suborder of thyreophorans are the Kyllosoria, which are divided into two groups based on the presence or absence of a tail club: the club-tailed ankylosaurs and the nodosaurs, which lacked tail clubs. Ankylosorians covered their bodies in armor that was more like scutes or spikes, and not like the flat plates that protruded from stegosaurs. All of these dermal ossifications would have been covered with a hard keratinous sheath, like the material that makes up beaks or our own fingernails. This would have made the armor even larger and sharper than the dermal bones we see fossilized today. Like our fingernails, this keratinous sheath may have been translucent, allowing light, and hence color, to transmit through. This leaves the possibility that this dermal armor may have had the ability to change color. Simply altering the blood flow beneath the horny covering may have been enough to change the color seen through the keratin. This ability may have been useful for display purposes as a visual means of communication. It might also have altered how infrared light in its heat was reflected or absorbed, working as a means of thermoregulation. Obviously, this armor coating served defensive purposes, deterring or injuring predators desperate or stupid enough to try penetrating it. This spiky armor alone seems to have been sufficient protection for nodosaurids to thrive from the late Jurassic through the end of the Cretaceous. Ankylosaurids, however, added the offensive measure of the tail club to their arsenal. Similar to the advanced theropods that stiffen their tails for steering, Ankylosaurs fused their distal tail vertebrae together to form a stiff lever to support and swing their heavy tail clubs. In addition to the presence and absence of tail clubs, Ankylosaurids and nodosaurids also have differently shaped mouths. At the front of the mouth, nodosaurids had narrow predentaries and premaxillae, while Ankylosaurs broadened the fronts of their mouths. This suggests they had slightly different eating strategies for slightly different menus. Both groups, however, had robust hyoid bones in the throat regions ventral to their skulls. The hyoid apparatus is actually made up of a number of bones in addition to hyoids, and this is where the musculature of the tongue attaches. Robust hyoids suggest that powerful, flexible tongues were probably a characteristic shared by Ankylosaurians. This tongue probably played a huge role in how they orally processed their food. We can tell from the microwear preserved on Ankylosaur teeth that they did grind food between their teeth. These teeth were small, though, and not tightly spaced, so they were not really built to withstand the almost constant chewing that other Ornithischian dinosaur clades seem to have been equipped to handle. We will discuss the other two major clades of Ornithischians and their masticatory prowess next week, though.